You are listening to the Objects of Affection collection, Study 165, Sundaram Tagore Gallery, Anti-Speculative Covenant, on relational capital, custodial architecture, and the gallerist who refuses the market's primary logic. When Sundaram Tagore opened his first gallery in Soho, New York in 2000, he was making a structural wager that the contemporary art market was not yet prepared to credit. That the relationships sustaining an object's circulation, between gallerist, artist, collector, and institution, are not incidental to the market but constitutive of it. A gallery, on this reading, is not a neutral display apparatus. It is a relational system, one that either amplifies or dampens the speculative forces acting on the objects it holds in trust. This study does not recapitulate the gallery's success as a story of friendship. The Objects of Affection collection framework is skeptical of exactly that register, the warm narrative of personal connection that so often functions as cover for the market dynamics operating beneath it. What the Sundaram Tagore Gallery's 25-year trajectory offers is a more productive object of analysis, a case study in whether relational capital can function as a genuine anti-speculative infrastructure, or whether it inevitably replicates the speculative velocity it claims to resist. The gallery's critics arrive at conflicting diagnoses. Both the custodial defense and the necrophage indictment contain partial truths. This study reads both against the documentary record. The founding premise, New York 2000. Sundaram Tagore founded his first gallery in Soho at a moment when the New York art market's geography was still organized around a clear hierarchy. Chelsea for the primary market's commercial operations, the Upper East Side for the established blue chip, Soho for residual experimentalism that was already beginning its commercial migration. To open in Soho in 2000 was to position at the edge of that migration, on a block that would, within a decade, be reorganized entirely by retail and tourism. This spatial positioning is not biographical detail. It tells us something about what kind of institution Tagore was attempting to build, one whose commercial viability was tied to curatorial conviction rather than address prestige. The gallery's stated founding mission, consistently articulated across its institutional communications, emphasizes cross-cultural explorations and a commitment to artists whose practice engages with materiality, permanence, and intellectual rigor. These are not unusual claims for a contemporary gallery. What is less common is the persistence with which the gallery's programming has maintained them across 25 years and 3 continents, without the market-driven pivot that typically accompanies a gallery's growth from a single space to an international institution. The Objects of Affection collection framework requires that we test such persistence against its own structural conditions. A gallerist who maintains curatorial commitment under commercial pressure is performing a version of the custodian's contract, the obligation to advocate for the artist's long-term interests against the short-term preferences of the market. Whether Tagore's model has sustained that contract across the gallery's expansion is the central question this study pursues. Roman 2, the architecture. 3 continents, 1 network. The gallery now maintains 3 active locations. New York, the founding Soho space, subsequently expanded, Singapore at the Gilman Barracks Arts Cluster, and London 27 Pall Mall opened in 2023. A 4th location in Hong Kong's Central District opened in 2008, was an earlier node of the network's Asian expansion. Together, these locations describe a geographic logic organized around the cultural corridors, where the gallery's cross-cultural programming could be institutionally anchored, rather than around the art market's primary speculative infrastructure. The contemporary art market's premium locations, Mayfair, Chelsea, the Upper East Side, Place des Vosges, function as speculative velocity accelerators. Their rental economies, their proximity to auction houses, their collector densities all select for galleries whose primary product is not the object itself, but the object's market position. The Sundaram Tagore Gallery's geographic choices have consistently been adjacencies rather than epicenters, positioned near, but not at the center of, the market's speculative infrastructure. This is not naive. It is a spatial expression of curatorial positioning. Singapore's Gilman Barracks is particularly legible on this reading. The development, a former British military base converted into a dedicated arts enclave, is an institutional proposition rather than a commercial one. A cluster of international galleries brought together by the Singapore Economic Development Board, positioned as a soft power apparatus for the city-state's cultural ambitions. A gallery that chooses Gilman Barracks over the Mayfair-adjacent enclaves of Singapore's commercial art scene is making a statement about the kind of institution it intends to be. That statement must be tested against the programmatic record. It is not self-validating, but it is legible and structurally different from the choice a purely speculative gallery would make. Roman 3. Material singularity. What the artists actually do. The gallery's represented roster includes Mia Andoh, Chun Kwang-young and Edward Burtynsky, three figures whose practice read through the post-luxury conceptual functional art framework. Each stages a different argument about what material singularity can mean in the contemporary market. Mia Andoh works primarily with layered metal surfaces, steel, aluminum, and iron treated with industrial and chemical processes that inscribe time directly into the object's material structure. The resulting panels are not images about temporality, they are objects constituted by it. The labor embedded in each work, the controlled oxidation, the grinding and polishing, the repeated interventions at each layer, resists easy reproduction, and thus resists the market's structural preference for additioned work that can be supplied to demand. This is labor density in its most literal form. A density that functions as a structural brake on speculation, precisely because it cannot be scaled without compromising the work's irreducibility. Chun Kwang-young's assemblages of mulberry paper represent a different approach to the same structural problem. Each work accumulates hand-torn, hand-bound triangular units, each carrying the textual residue of traditional Korean book printing, built up over hundreds of individually significant gestures into surfaces that record the accumulation of labor without displaying it overtly. The object's value cannot be passed from their making. Their market price would need to account for a labor economy that contemporary art pricing has no mechanism to register accurately. The custodian's contract an owner takes on with such a work is correspondingly substantial. The object's integrity depends on conditions of care, humidity, handling, storage, conservation, that the secondary market routinely discounts at the point of resale. Edward Burtynsky's large-format photographs of industrial landscapes, oil fields, shipbreaking yards, lithium mining operations, tailings ponds, occupy a more structurally complex position. Photography is inherently reproducible. Burtynsky's editions are not small, yet the work's consistent insistence on rendering extraction beautiful creates a particular kind of ethical weight. The collector who owns a Burtynsky panel lives with both the aesthetic experience of the image and its documentary function as evidence of the industrial processes that underpin the global economy. This is a form of semantic burden. The object carries a meaning structure that resists purely speculative treatment, not through material irreproducibility, but through conceptual consequence. A collector who liquidates a Burtynsky at auction for a speculative gain is not merely closing a financial position. They are discarding a custodial relationship with a body of evidence. The three artists do not share a single aesthetic program or cultural origin. What they share is a resistance, at the level of either material or conceptual structure, to the hollowing out that speculative circulation performs on objects it treats as purely financial instruments. A gallery whose sustained roster includes all three is making an implicit claim about the kind of value it is in the business of building and maintaining. Roman 4. Frontiers Reimagined. The Venice Collateral in 2015, Tagore served as commissioner and co-curator, with Marius Quint, of Frontiers Reimagined, an official collateral event of the 56th International Art Exhibition of La Biennale di Venezia, staged at the Museo di Palazzo Grimani from May through November. The exhibition gathered 44 artists from 25 countries around the proposition that art, at a moment of intensifying political and ecological fracture, could function as a genuine technology for cross-cultural understanding, rather than simply a display of cultural difference for market consumption. Venice Biennale collateral events are a revealing institutional object, and the Objects of Affection collection has analyzed the biennial's structural logic in its study of Kiev Seoul 2026 as speculative infrastructure. Unlike national pavilions, funded by states, organized as cultural diplomacy, insulated from commercial pressure by sovereign backing, collateral events are privately organized and must navigate the biennial's institutional prestige economy without state subsidy. They compete for critical attention in an environment saturated with competing claims on the same critical vocabulary. Frontiers Reimagined was in this sense a test. Could a gallerist's curatorial premise sustain itself at the highest level of institutional validation, or would the prestige pressure of the Venice context flatten it into an internationally legible but critically emptied gesture? The Objects of Affection collection framework reads such moments through the lens of aura transaction. The institutional prestige of the Venice Biennale is exchangeable for a particular kind of cultural authority, and a gallery that successfully conducts this transaction gains a reputational asset that is simultaneously genuine and available for market exploitation. The question is not whether Frontiers Reimagined was artistically substantive. By multiple curatorial and critical accounts, it was a coherent and ambitious exhibition, but whether the institutional prestige it generated translated into curatorial constraints on what the gallery could subsequently represent, or whether it simply expanded the gallery's market position within an unchanged speculative logic. Read against the subsequent decade of programming. The evidence suggests the former. The gallery's post-Venice exhibition record has maintained the same geographic reach and artist development commitment that characterized the pre-Venice program. The Aura transaction does not appear to have converted into pure prestige capital without curatorial content. But this is a provisional judgment, made at a point in the gallery's development where the pressures of its own institutional success are still manageable. V. Social capital and the custodian's contract. The custodian's contract, in the post-luxury conceptual functional art framework, encompasses the full set of institutional commitments a gallery takes on when it agrees to represent an artist. The obligation to advocate for work that may not be market-ready, to resist collector pressure to direct artists toward commercially safer practices, to maintain the work's discursive context against the flattening effect of resale, and to sustain the artist's institutional visibility through periods when the market has moved its attention elsewhere. The gallery model Tagore has built is explicitly relational in the sense the framework requires. The gallery's public institutional documentation describes a practice organized around long-term relationships with artists, collectors, and museums, rather than market timing or trend following. The Tagore Foundation International, a separate organizational entity, adds a preservation and exchange dimension, positioned explicitly outside the commercial logic of the gallery operation. This structure is, on its surface, compatible with the custodian's contract. A gallerist who maintains sustained representation of artists through commercially difficult periods, who resists the pressure to pivot toward more market-responsive work, who invests in the institutional context, publications, museum placements, curatorial collaborations, that sustains an artist's long-term discursive position, is performing an institutional function that the art market's primary speculative logic systematically undervalues. The Objects of Affection collection's analysis of the Ernesto Esposito Warhol collection, in the study The Custodian's Trap, established the conditions under which custodial commitment converts into custodial captivity. The moment when the institution's investment in an artist's legacy becomes so substantial that the institution can no longer act in the artist's interest without acting against its own. The Tagore model, read at its best, is an attempt to build the relational infrastructure that prevents that conversion. A gallery network whose long-term artist relationships are sufficiently distributed across geographies and collector bases that no single relationship creates an overriding structural dependency. The harder question is whether the relational capital the gallery has accumulated over 25 years, legitimate as its origins are, has become an asset class in its own right. Relational capital that converts into gallery prestige, press attention, and secondary market performance is no longer simply custodial. It has acquired its own speculative function, one that operates independently of the individual objects the gallery handles and potentially in tension with their curatorial interests. The Objects of Affection collection does not assert that this conversion has occurred at the Sundaram Tagore Gallery. It asserts that the structural conditions for it are present, and that naming those conditions is what the post-luxury conceptual functional art framework requires. VI, the necrophage diagnosis, when networks become commodity. The contemporary art world's accelerating commercialization has produced a well-documented phenomenon, the professionalization of exactly the relationships and cultural gestures that were once its informal infrastructure. Studio visits are now conducted on appointment with pricing sheets. Collector cultivation is managed by relationship managers working from CRM systems. Artist career trajectories are planned against auction cycles and fair schedules. The discourse of authentic connection and long-term commitment that distinguished certain galleries from the purely transactional has become, in this environment, a category designation. A marketing position, available for adoption by any sufficiently sophisticated operator. The institutional necrophagy diagnosis applies when institutions consume the critical vocabulary of their own alternatives. A gallery that positions itself as anti-speculative in ways that become a premium market signal has completed a necrophagic turn. The content of the critique has been absorbed by the system being critiqued, and what remains is the form, the language, the positioning, the geographic restraint, without the substance. This is the condition the objects of affection collection diagnosed in its analysis of invasive commodification, the process by which critical frameworks are systematically absorbed and neutralized by the commercial structures they name. Institutional necrophagy does not require bad faith. It requires only that the market's translation mechanism works faster than the institution's capacity for self-examination. The Sundaram Tagore Gallery has not, on the Objects of Affection collection's reading of the available evidence, completed this turn. The gallery's artist roster, geographic positioning and curatorial programming continue to express priorities that are not reducible to market optimization. But the structural conditions for necrophagy are present. A gallery with substantial institutional prestige, a geographic network that provides access to multiple collector markets simultaneously, and a curatorial language, cross-cultural dialogue, material integrity, long-term commitment, that maps cleanly onto the preferences of a collector class that has, in the past decade, begun to treat anti-speculative positioning as its own form of sophistication. The Objects of Affection collection does not interpret this convergence as evidence of bad faith. It interprets it as structural pressure, one that the gallery's institutional design will need to actively resist if its curatorial commitments are to remain substantive rather than nominal. Roman 7. Against speculative velocity, the structural position. The gallery's most legible structural defense against the necrophagic risk lies in its curatorial logic at the level of artist development. Representing Mia Ando, Chun Kwang-young, and Bertinsky in 2026 is not a speculative bet on rising artists whose market has not yet been discovered. All three have established auction records, institutional collections, and critical documentation. The gallery is not in the business of discovering artists before the market does in order to profit from the discovery. It is in the business of sustained representation, maintaining the conditions under which already established artists can develop their work against the pressure of a market expectation for more of the same. This sustained representation model functions as a structural variant of the anti-sale covenant, not the formal resale restriction covenant that some primary market galleries negotiate at the point of sale, but a de facto commitment to the artist's long-term trajectory rather than the work's immediate market moment. A gallery that maintains representation of an artist through a decade of steady auction performance and critical consolidation, without pivoting to newer names whose speculative potential is higher, is making a choice with real costs. The opportunity cost of the speculative discovery model that many of the gallery's commercial competitors pursue, measured in the marketizing artists it did not sign. The gallery's three-continent infrastructure, developed over 25 years, is itself a costly apparatus to sustain. The operational expense of maintaining active spaces in New York, Singapore and London selects for a business model that requires either high-value, sustained sales across multiple markets simultaneously, or the kind of institutional and collector relationships that generate steady rather than spectacular revenue. Neither is available to a gallerist who cycles through artists as market opportunities present themselves. The infrastructure is, in this sense, an anti-speculative commitment encoded in operational cost. It creates pressures that select for long-termism and select against the trend following that the speculative model rewards. The remainder of this study continues at objectsofaffectioncollection.com. This has been a study from the Objects of Affection collection, a critical art research institution operating under the framework of post-luxury conceptual functional art. Read the full research at objectsofaffectioncollection.com.